My name is Adrienne Vale. I am 28 years old. Today, I own companies worth millions of dollars. Investors call me disciplined. Competitors call me ruthless. Business magazines call me visionary. But none of them knew the boy I used to be. I was not born into money. I was born into silence, into struggle, into a kind of poverty that does not scream. It tightens around your chest until breathing itself feels expensive. I grew up in Red Hollow, Colorado. It is the kind of place where the wind never stops moving. Red cliffs surround the town like walls. The air is dry. The roads are quiet. People wave at each other because there is nothing else to do. In Red Hollow, everyone knows your name, and everyone knows what you are supposed to become. My family lived at the edge of town, almost as if the map itself was embarrassed to include us. The house was old wood and faded paint. The porch groaned every time someone stepped on it. In winter, the walls felt thin enough to hear the cold pressing against them. My father, Victor Vale, was a garage mechanic. His hands were permanently stained with oil. His back curved slightly forward from years of bending under engines. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried weight. My mother, Helena Vale, worked double shifts at a roadside diner just off Highway 48. She smelled of coffee and fryer grease when she came home at night. Her smile was always gentle, even when exhaustion sat behind her eyes. We never sat at the dinner table and said, "We are poor." We didn't need to. We felt it in every decision. Winter nights were the hardest. The heater rattled more than it warmed. My mother would quietly add another blanket to my bed and pretend she wasn't cold. I would sometimes wake up and see her sitting in the kitchen, wrapped in a coat, drinking tea to stay warm. That is when I learned something that stayed with me. Poverty is not loud. It whispers every time you want something you cannot afford. It reminds you of your limits before the world even has to. By 17, I had already decided I would not live and die within those limits. I earned a partial academic scholarship to study business administration. When the letter arrived, my mother cried in the kitchen. My father simply nodded and said, "Good, now don't waste it." I didn't choose business because I loved suits or boardrooms. I chose it because I wanted control. Control over money. Control over opportunity. Control over how people looked at the name Vale. The scholarship was not enough to cover everything, so while studying, I worked. That is how I ended up at Blackridge Textile Corporation, the largest garment manufacturing company in the Stonebridge Industrial Zone. Blackridge was not just a factory. It was the economic backbone of the region. Hundreds of workers, massive supply chains, international buyers. To most people, it was just clothing manufacturing. To me, it was a classroom disguised as a job. I started in logistics and data tracking, long hours in front of spreadsheets, inventory reconciliation, shipment verification, supplier comparisons. To others, it was repetitive. To me, it was access. I studied their supply chains carefully, where materials came from, how pricing fluctuated, which suppliers had leverage, where delays cost them the most money. I paid attention to patterns. I noticed inefficiencies. I built mental maps of their entire operational structure. I wasn't just clocking in and out. I was studying how power is built. That was when I first saw her. Cassandra Whitlock. The first time I noticed her, she was standing on the factory floor wearing a navy coat that probably cost more than our monthly grocery bill. She moved with confidence, speaking to department heads without hesitation. She did not look out of place. She owned the space. Because in a way she did. She was the daughter of Edward Whitlock, founder and owner of Blackridge, a self-made industrialist who had turned a small textile workshop into a regional powerhouse. Cassandra was a Harvard graduate, sharp mind, measured tone, observant eyes. The first time she spoke to me directly, it was almost ordinary. She leaned slightly over my workstation and said, "You optimized this reporting model." I nodded, yes. She studied the screen longer than I expected. Most executives would have walked away. Instead, she asked questions. Precise ones. Why did I restructure supplier comparison metrics? Why did I flag certain shipping inconsistencies? What did I think was the company's largest vulnerability? No one had ever asked me what I thought before. That was the beginning. She started appearing in operations more often. We discussed automation costs, margin compression, overseas supplier risks, labor efficiency ratios. We debated. We disagreed. But we listened. And somewhere between late inventory audits and quiet coffee breaks in the staff lounge, the conversation shifted. They became personal. One evening, we stood on the factory rooftop overlooking the industrial lights of Stonebridge. The air smelled faintly of fabric dye and metal. She asked me, "Adrian, what do you really want?" There was no hesitation in my answer. I want to build something so powerful that no one can ever look down on me again. She studied my face, not with pity, but with curiosity. "You don't deserve to be looked down on," she said softly. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe her. That was my mistake. Rent Hollow may be small, but news spreads quickly. It didn't take long for her father to hear rumors. One afternoon, I was summoned to the executive office. Edward Whitlock stood behind a glass desk overlooking the factory floor. The city stretched beyond the windows. He did not offer me a seat. "You're intelligent," he began calmly. "You have potential." I said nothing. "But intelligence," he continued, "does not change where you come from." The words were controlled, polished, surgical. Then he stepped closer. "You will not see my daughter again if you value your position here." There was no shouting, no threats, just hierarchy. He did not insult me directly. He did not need to. He reminded me of my place. And in that moment, I understood exactly how the world categorized people like me. I walked out of that office feeling something heavier than anger. It was clarity. Outside, rain was falling steadily. I chose to walk home instead of taking the bus. Each step felt deliberate. Not because I had lost a job, but because I had been measured and dismissed. When I entered the house, my father looked up from the kitchen table. He did not ask many questions in life, but he always saw through me. "They underestimated you," he asked. I nodded. He stood up slowly and placed his rough, oil-scarred hand on my shoulder. "Then make them regret it." That night, I did not sleep. I opened my laptop and reviewed every system I had studied at Blackridge. Their supplier dependency was dangerously concentrated. Their logistics infrastructure was outdated. Their cost structures were inflated by complacency. They were powerful, but they were inefficient. And inefficiency is weakness. As the rain continued outside my thin-walled childhood home, something inside me shifted. I stopped wanting success, and I started planning dominance. The night I decided to build my own company, I had exactly $3,842 in my bank account. I remember the number because I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't capital. It was defiance. I didn't tell Cassandra. I didn't tell anyone at Blackridge. And I definitely didn't tell Edward Whitlock. But I did tell my father. He was sitting in the garage, wiping grease from his hands. I'm going to start my own garment company, I said. He didn't laugh. He didn't look surprised. He just asked one question. Are you ready to lose everything? I answered honestly. I already have nothing. That was the beginning. The first move. I didn't quit Blackridge immediately. I observed more. I documented more. I studied supplier contracts and noticed something critical. Smaller regional brands were underserved. Blackridge focused on massive orders from global retailers. They ignored boutique labels, emerging e-commerce brands, and small private designers. That gap was opportunity. I started reaching out quietly. Late nights. Cold emails. Phone calls no one answered at first. Most ignored me. Some laughed. But one small Denver-based streetwear startup responded. They needed a manufacturer willing to handle low-volume, high-quality production runs. Blackridge would never take a contract that small. I would, but I couldn't do it alone. That's when I made the decision that would shape everything that followed. I brought in my cousins, Daniel and Marcus Vale. We grew up together, shared holidays, shared hand-me-down clothes, shared the same last name that meant nothing to the outside world. Daniel was sharp with numbers. Marcus was good with people. I thought blood meant trust. I was wrong. Vale Garments was born in a warehouse that smelled like dust. We rented a small abandoned warehouse just outside Red Hollow. The roof leaked slightly when it rained. The electricity flickered. The concrete floors were cracked. It was perfect. Because it was ours. We bought second-hand industrial sewing machines. We negotiated aggressively with smaller fabric suppliers who were tired of being bullied by corporations like Blackridge. I built the operational structure. Daniel handled accounting. Marcus secured local staffing. We worked 18-hour days. I slept on a folding cot inside the warehouse more than once. There were nights I questioned everything. Was I delusional? Was Edward right? But then the first payment from that Denver startup cleared. It wasn't large, but it was proof. We delivered on time. Quality exceeded expectations. They referred us to another brand, then another. Within 8 months, Vale Garments was profitable. Not wealthy, but stable. And that's when Blackridge noticed. The first collision. I knew they would eventually. Regional supply chain shifts don't go unnoticed. One afternoon, a major local retailer that had worked with Blackridge for years approached us for a bid. We undercut them by 15%. We offered faster turnaround. We won the contract. I will never forget the look on Edward Whitlock's face when we crossed paths at a regional business event weeks later. He recognized me, not as an employee, as a threat. You're ambitious, he said quietly. I learned from the best, I replied. His eyes hardened. That should have been my warning. Growth changes people. As revenue increased, so did pressure. Daniel began pushing for aggressive expansion. Marcus wanted to leverage our momentum for larger, riskier contracts. I remained cautious. We scale smart, I insisted, not fast. But money changes the way people think. Daniel began making financial decisions without consulting me. Short-term loans, equipment leases with steep interest rates. Marcus started promising delivery timelines that strained production capacity. I confronted them. This isn't how we agreed to run this, I said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. You're acting like you built this alone. The words hit harder than I expected, because deep down I had. Not physically, but strategically. Still, I swallowed it. We were family. I convinced myself tension was normal. I convinced myself loyalty would win. I was wrong again. The betrayal, it happened quietly. No dramatic confrontation. No shouting. Just paperwork. One morning, I arrived at the warehouse to find several machines gone. Accounts frozen. Our largest client unresponsive. Daniel and Marcus were nowhere to be found. By afternoon, I discovered the truth. They had opened a separate entity weeks earlier, transferred key clients under new contracts, used our capital as leverage to secure private investment. They didn't just leave. They extracted. And they left me holding the debt. When I confronted Daniel by phone, his voice was cold. "It's business, Adrian. You taught us that." Marcus didn't even answer my calls. Blood is not loyalty. Blood is just biology. That night, I sat alone in the warehouse that had once felt like a kingdom in progress. The lights flickered. The silence was heavier than poverty ever was. I had built something real, and it had been stolen by the only people I trusted. But here's what they underestimated. They thought I would collapse. They thought humiliation would break me again. They forgot something important. I had already survived being dismissed by power once. This time, I understood the game better. I wasn't starting from nothing anymore. I was starting from knowledge. And knowledge is leverage. As I locked the warehouse doors that night, I made a promise to myself. No more emotional decisions. No more blind trust. No more mercy in business. If they wanted to play ruthlessly, I would master the game. When Daniel and Marcus walked away with my clients, my capital, and my momentum, they believed they had ended my story. They didn't understand something fundamental. You can steal contracts. You can steal equipment. You can even steal money. But you cannot steal pattern recognition. And I had spent years studying patterns. The morning after the betrayal, I did not panic. I did not scream. I sat in the empty warehouse, surrounded by silence, and I mapped the damage. Debt obligations. Remaining assets. Legal exposure. Supplier relationships. The numbers were ugly, but they were not fatal. That distinction matters. Most people collapse when they feel emotional loss. I had already learned to separate emotion from execution. Still, I won't pretend it didn't hurt. It wasn't the money. It was the realization that shared childhood memories don't translate into shared ambition. Daniel had always envied leadership. Marcus had always wanted shortcuts. I had ignored the signs because I wanted loyalty to be real. Now I had clarity. And clarity is sharper than anger. The legal trap. Within days, I learned how calculated their move had been. They hadn't just taken clients. They had structured exit clauses months earlier, quietly. They had positioned themselves as operational heads for specific accounts. When they left, those accounts legally followed them. I could fight it. But litigation would drain whatever I had left. So I didn't fight. I adapted. Instead of trying to reclaim what was stolen, I asked a different question. What do they need that they cannot replicate without me? The answer was infrastructure. I had designed the systems. Supplier integrations. Production forecasting models. Cost optimization frameworks. They had clients. I had the blueprint. And blueprints scale. Starting again, but smarter. I closed the original warehouse. Painful, but necessary. I negotiated settlements with suppliers personally. I visited them face to face. I didn't blame my cousins. I blamed internal restructuring. Because reputation is currency. Then I moved operations to a smaller, more controlled facility outside Stonebridge. No partners. No shared authority. Every contract passed through me. I focused on something I had learned while studying Blackridge. Speed. Large corporations move slowly. New competitors overextend. I positioned myself between those weaknesses. Instead of targeting large regional retailers, I went after fast-growing online brands. Direct-to-consumer labels. Social media-driven fashion startups. Influencer merchandise lines. They valued agility more than legacy. And I could deliver that. Cassandra returned. I did not expect to see her again. But power circles are small. We crossed paths at a private industry networking event in Denver. She saw me before I saw her. Adrian. Her voice hadn't changed. Controlled, calm, observant. I nodded, Cassandra. There was no hostility in her eyes. There was curiosity. I heard about your expansion, she said carefully. Expansion. Interesting choice of word. She knew. Of course she knew. Blackridge monitored competitors closely now. Especially me. Your father must be proud, I replied. A subtle edge. She didn't flinch. My father doesn't scare easily, she said. Neither do I thought. But what she said next surprised me. He underestimated you. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't denial either. We talked for 20 minutes. Business only. No rooftop confessions. No personal vulnerability. And yet something unspoken lingered. She respected what I had done. And I realized something dangerous. A part of me still cared. That was a liability. The quiet war. Within a year, my new company, Veil Dynamics, was lean, efficient, and profitable again. Smaller than Blackridge. Smaller than my cousin's new firm, but more precise. I automated forecasting models using predictive analytics. I diversified supplier bases across 3 states. I negotiated flexible production contracts. I studied Blackridge's public filings. I analyzed their hiring patterns. I tracked their expansion into international markets. And then I saw it. They were overextending. Edward Whitlock was pushing into overseas mass production to cut costs. That meant longer supply chains, higher risk exposure, lower adaptability. If disrupted properly, it would hurt. But I didn't attack directly. I positioned myself as the reliable domestic alternative. When 2 mid-size brands experienced delays from overseas suppliers, I was ready. Fast turnaround. Transparent pricing. Guaranteed fulfillment. They signed with me, not because I was braver, but because I was safer. That's how wars are won quietly, not with explosions, with leverage. My cousins feel the pressure. Daniel called me 6 months later, not to apologize, to probe. I've been hearing your name more often, he said casually. Good, I replied. Their expansion had been aggressive, too aggressive. High-interest loans. Rapid hiring. Overpromised delivery timelines. I had seen this before, at Blackridge. Complacency creates weakness. Greed accelerates it. Within another year, their company missed a major delivery deadline. Penalty clauses triggered. Investors grew nervous. And who do nervous investors call? Competitors. I didn't sabotage them. I didn't need to. I waited. And when one of their largest clients began quietly looking for alternatives, I was already prepared. That contract shifted everything, not just financially, symbolically. They realized something that day. They hadn't removed me from the game. They had trained me for it. The man I was becoming. At 28, I looked in the mirror one night and saw someone different. More composed. More strategic. Less emotional. Was I becoming ruthless? Maybe. But here is the truth no one talks about. Mercy is a luxury of the secure. I had spent too long being underestimated. Now I understood power structures. I understood negotiation psychology. I understood leverage timing. And most importantly, I understood that revenge is most effective when it looks like growth. Blackridge was starting to lose regional dominance. My cousins were bleeding capital. And Cassandra was watching all of it. The question was no longer whether I could compete. The question was how far I was willing to go. Because there was still one thing I had not confronted. Edward Whitlock. And he was not finished with me either. Success attracts attention. Dominance attracts enemies. By the time I turned 28, Veil Dynamics was no longer a quiet alternative in the market. We were a disruption, a pattern shift, a problem. Blackridge had begun losing regional contracts steadily, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but consistently. And corporations fear trends more than losses. That's when the pressure started. The first strike, it began subtly. A supplier I had worked with for 18 months suddenly backed out of a contract. No warning. No negotiation. Just an email. We are restructuring our distribution priorities. 2 days later, another supplier delayed shipment citing unexpected compliance review. Then a third. Patterns. I don't believe in coincidence in business. Someone was applying pressure upstream. Only one company had both the leverage and the motivation. Blackridge. Edward Whitlock wasn't loud. He was strategic. He couldn't crush me publicly without drawing regulatory attention. But he could squeeze my oxygen supply. And oxygen in manufacturing is materials. The emergency room. For 72 hours, I barely slept. Production schedules began slipping. Clients grew anxious. Penalty clauses loomed. If 3 more shipments failed, I would lose the trust I had spent years rebuilding. That's when I made the decision that separated ambition from resolve. I flew to North Carolina overnight. Cold visits, no appointments. I walked into mid-sized textile mills that had never heard of Val Dynamics and pitched them directly. No assistance. No PR language. No corporate mask. Just numbers. I showed them projected volume growth. I offered long-term contracts with fair margins. I guaranteed faster payment cycles than Blackridge. Most refused. One didn't. It was smaller, independent, hungry. That was enough. By the end of the week, production resumed. Slower, more expensive, but stable. Edward had tested my structure. It bent. It did not break. Cassandra's visit. 3 weeks later, Cassandra walked into my office unannounced. Not at an event. Not in a public space. My office. That was intentional. She looked composed, but her eyes carried something new. Concern. "You've been busy," she said. "So has your father," I replied. Silence lingered. She didn't deny it. Instead, she stepped closer to my desk. "He believes you're positioning yourself to damage Blackridge long-term." "I'm positioning myself to survive," I said calmly. "You know that's not entirely true." She was right. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was advancing. Then she said something I didn't expect. "He's preparing something larger." That was not a warning. That was a choice. In that moment, Cassandra stood between blood and truth. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Her answer was quiet. "Because this doesn't have to become destruction." But here's what she didn't understand. For men like her father, competition always becomes destruction. The only difference is who collapses first. The audit. 2 months later, the second strike came. A federal compliance audit. Random, according to the letter. Extensive, according to the scope. It froze major shipments for review. Clients panicked. Investors hesitated. The timing was surgical. Blackridge had connections, lobbyists, political relationships. I couldn't prove interference, but I could calculate probability. And probability told me this was engineered. Instead of resisting, I cooperated aggressively. Full transparency, immediate documentation, voluntary internal review. Because I had built Veil Dynamics lean and clean after my cousin's betrayal, there were no hidden liabilities. The audit concluded with minor recommendations, no violations. The attempt had failed, but the message was clear. Edward Whitlock was no longer underestimating me. He was trying to exhaust me. The confrontation. It happened at the annual Stonebridge Manufacturing Summit. Private event. Closed doors. Industry leaders only. Edward approached me first. Older now, sharper somehow. "You've grown bold," he said. "I've grown prepared," I answered. He studied me differently this time. Not dismissive. Assessing. "You're costing me contracts," he continued. "Competition isn't theft," I replied. He stepped closer. "You mistake resilience for invincibility." And there it was. Not anger. Warning. I held his gaze. "You mistook poverty for weakness." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not rage. Recognition. He realized something important in that moment. I was no longer reacting to him. I was operating independently of him. He could attempt pressure, but he no longer defined the battlefield. My cousin's collapse. While Blackridge and I circled each other, Daniel and Marcus were unraveling. Their aggressive loans matured. Investor patience evaporated. Production delays multiplied. They called me again, not probing this time, desperate. "Adrian, we need liquidity," Daniel said. Liquidity. The word almost made me smile. They wanted partnership. Capital injection. Strategic alignment. In other words, rescue. I met them once. Neutral ground. No anger in my voice. No visible satisfaction. I offered terms. Majority control. Operational authority. Debt restructuring under my supervision. They refused. Pride is expensive. 3 months later, their company declared bankruptcy. Assets liquidated. Clients dispersed. Several of those clients signed with me. I did not celebrate. I simply recorded the shift. Blood is not loyalty, but it is history. And history teaches. The question. By the end of that year, Veil Dynamics had surpassed my cousin's former revenue and closed the gap with Blackridge regionally. Investors who once ignored my emails now requested meetings. Cassandra continued to appear at events. Professional, guarded. There was something unresolved between us. But ambition had replaced affection. And I had learned something critical. Power isolates. The higher you rise, the fewer people speak honestly to you. One night, standing alone in my office overlooking Stonebridge, I asked myself something I had avoided for years. Was this still about proving them wrong? Or had I become addicted to winning? Because there is a difference, and only one of them leads to peace. Edward Whitlock was preparing another move. I could feel it. But I was no longer the boy in the rain walking home humiliated. I was the storm approaching his foundation. And storms do not ask permission. There is a strange silence that comes before something ends. Not chaos, not noise, stillness. I felt it 3 months before everything shifted. Blackridge had stopped applying pressure. No supplier interference, no regulatory friction, no quiet intimidation. That didn't mean peace. It meant preparation. Edward Whitlock was not a reactive man. He was strategic. If he wasn't striking, he was restructuring. And I was right. The announcement. The industry press release hit on a Monday morning. Blackridge Textile Corporation was entering a strategic merger with an international manufacturing conglomerate. Massive capital infusion. Expanded global distribution. Vertical integration across continents. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was risky. International mergers move slowly. They bleed efficiency during integration. Culture clashes disrupt execution. Supply chains stretch thin. Edward wasn't strengthening his foundation. He was betting everything on scale. He believed size would crush agility. He believed I couldn't compete at that level. He underestimated something again. I didn't need to be bigger. I needed to be indispensable. The final offer. 2 weeks after the merger announcement, I received a formal meeting request. Not from Cassandra. From Edward. Private location. No media. No assistance. When I walked into the room, he looked older. Not weaker. Just aware. "You've built something impressive," he began. No insult this time. No reminder of where I came from. Just acknowledgement. "The market is consolidating," he continued. "Independent operators will struggle." "I haven't struggled in years," I replied calmly. He studied me for a long moment. Then he said it. "I want to acquire Val Dynamics." There it was. Full circle. The man who once refused me a chair was now offering me an exit. It wasn't a hostile takeover proposal. It was generous. Life-changing wealth. Board position. Executive autonomy within the merged structure. Control in another form. Many would have accepted immediately. But I didn't answer. Instead, I asked one question. Why? He didn't hesitate. "Because you built what I can no longer replicate internally." That was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. Cassandra's choice. That evening, Cassandra called me. Not to negotiate. To speak openly. "If you sell," she said, "you win financially." "And if I don't?" I asked. "You force him to compete at a speed he's not built for anymore." There was something else beneath her voice. Something personal. "He won't step down," she added quietly. "Not until he's forced to." That was the first time she admitted the tension between legacy and evolution. Her father represented structure. I represented disruption. She stood between both worlds. "Where do you stand?" I asked her. A pause. "Where the future is." That was not a romantic answer. It was a strategic one. The decision. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of the choice. For years, I told myself I wanted dominance. But dominance over what? A company? A man's ego? A past insult? If I sold, I would become wealthy beyond necessity. If I refused, I would enter open competition with a newly merged global machine. One path was safe. One path was war. In the morning, I called Edward. I'm declining the acquisition, I said. Silence. Then measured acceptance. I expected that. Of course he did. He finally understood me. This was never about joining his table. It was about building my own. The shift. Over the next year, the merger strained Blackridge's operations exactly as I predicted. Integration delays, logistical misalignment, leadership friction. Val dynamics moved faster. We secured contracts that required adaptability, not size. We invested in domestic automation and nearshore manufacturing models. While they expanded outward, we optimized inward. The market didn't collapse for them, but it tilted. Gradually, irreversibly. Edward Whitlock stepped down 18 months later, officially for strategic transition. Unofficially because the board needed evolution. Cassandra assumed a major leadership role within the new structure. And for the first time, we met not as adversaries' children, but as equals. The truth about revenge, I expected to feel triumph. I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Stillness. The humiliation that once burned in my chest no longer had heat. Edward never apologized. He didn't need to. He recognized me. That was enough. I realized something that night standing alone in my office. Revenge is not destroying someone. It is removing their power over your identity. For years, I thought I was building an empire to prove him wrong. But I wasn't. I was building it so I would never again doubt myself. Red Hollow. I visited my parents' old house recently. The porch still creaks. The wind still moves through the red cliffs. But I met the same boy who once lay under layered blankets, listening to winter press against thin walls. I don't hate where I came from. I understand it. Poverty shaped my hunger. Humiliation sharpened my strategy. Betrayal refined my discipline. And love, even complicated love, taught me restraint. I am 28 years old. I built something from nothing. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to be defined by someone else's limits. And that is the only victory that lasts.